The category is What the Trans, darling?
Oh my god, I'm sick of lockdown. Welcome to What the Trans!
What the Trans? Yeah, so sick of it. Bored now. Let me out. Let me go and rehearse with the band, right? That's kind of all I want to do, but yeah.
I just want to go and buy a £4 pot of veggie vegan food that I get sometimes. That's what I miss. It's just like there's this little place that I go to where I just go, I get my pot of veggie stuff, I sit there, I read random crap on my phone. Occasionally I chat with the lady who serves it. She's really nice and has got some kids in school and they're causing all sorts of chaos. And I need my update on those kids. I need that bowl of food.
Yeah, it's getting to the point, and I'm not the first one to observe this, but it's kind of getting to the point lockdown-wise where everybody has just lost track of what day it is.
Yeah, I'm the one telling people now because this has kind of been my life for years, so I know what day it is most times because I got used to it. I'm the people's timekeeper.
I was talking to a friend of mine that still works somewhere that I used to work, and apparently in one of the kind of, morning meetings that they do, there was a 10-minute sort of discussion between a couple of the execs about which day it was. So, and it's like, you guys, you can just click on the calendar, bottom corner of your laptop there.
So is that the agenda? First point of order. What day is this?
What day is it? Yeah.
Who's the Prime Minister?
It's when you get to the any other business section that things start getting really trippy because everybody's lost what day it is and everybody's spent an hour in a really dull meeting. So,
and it just ends with someone just being like, I need to reach out to someone. Mm-hmm. I need some kind of human contact of some kind. Help me!
It reaches out 118 times a second. It reaches out. And if you get that reference, you're a nerd.
I do not, but it is quite funny. And yeah, as you're signalled by your we should do some terrible news.
Ooh, terrible indeed, sadly.
Yeah, really terrible. Like, truly the opening shots of some horrors.
Well, let's do the details and then let's get snarky about it, which I think is what we usually do.
I think so. Well, if not, we'll start doing it now. So here is the news, which you have probably heard a little something about if you happen to be a trans, non-binary, or indeed intersex person. On Wednesday, the 22nd of April, the Government Minister for Women and Equalities, Liz Truss, was giving evidence to the Parliamentary Women and Equalities Select Committee. Usually these sessions are where MPs hold the government to account, and these sessions are sort of like the court where ministers and other witnesses are compelled by law not to tell lies. So when it comes to what is being said there, it has to be taken seriously.
The goal of this session in particular was to question Liz Truss on what her aims were for the Government Equalities Office over the next year. So obviously you would expect her to announce that the COVID-19 recovery would be a priority, as well as possibly announcing working with the Home Office to tackle the alarming rates of domestic abuse that has resulted thanks to thousands of victims being locked down with their abusers. But Truss isn't like the rest of us who are concerned about these issues. Once Caroline Noakes, who is the chair of the subcommittee, opened the session, Liz Truss gave a statement where she explained that she hopes to move away from dealing with quote-unquote groups that need to be catered for, and moving towards looking at individuals who are facing barriers to achieving success and access to public services. She outlined that she wanted to move the Equalities Office to a more data-focused approach, but then talked also about how her focus will be on women's economic empowerment, which would usually be good news if it wasn't for the fact that women are dying and being abused in the here and now. She made the point that she wanted more women to be starting businesses and will be working towards that goal, even though women dying lots maybe now is not quite the right time to talk about women opening businesses when we have a global depression coming down the tracks towards us. Anyway.
After that, which... fine. After that, she made an astonishing stop in trans issues land when she said the following.
The final point I'd like to make, Madam Chairman, in this initial part is on the issue of the Gender Recognition Act. We've been doing a lot of work internally, making sure that we're in a position to respond to that consultation and launch what we propose to do on the future of the Gender Recognition Act. We will be in a position to do that by the summer. And there are 3 very important principles that I will be putting in place. First of all, the protection of single-sex spaces, which is extremely important. Secondly, making sure that transgender adults are free to live their lives as they wish without fear of persecution, whilst maintaining the proper checks and balances in the system. And finally, which is not a direct issue concerning the Gender Recognition Act, but is relevant, making sure that the under 18s are protected from decisions that they could make that are irreversible in the future. So I believe strongly that adults should have the freedom to live their lives as they see fit. But I think it's very important that while people are still developing their decision-making capabilities, that we protect them from making those irreversible decisions. So, of course, some of these policies, Chair, have been delayed by the specific issues around COVID, but I can assure you that alongside the COVID work, our officials continue to do those things to make them happen.
Now, obviously, that is a very alarming listen, and I'm sure you have many, many, many questions. But only 2 members of the committee followed up on this for more detail. First was Sarah Brickcliffe, who is the Conservative MP for Hyndburn.
You mentioned the Gender Recognition Act and stated that we would see progress in the summer on this. Can you just elaborate on what progress you are talking about there, please?
So before the summer, we will make an announcement on our response to the consultation and how we're going to proceed on the Gender Recognition Act. So that's before the summer recess.
Okay. And other important equality objectives, do you believe the pandemic will further delay those too?
In terms of the Gender Recognition Act, we've obviously had a lot of work to do. We've now completed that work. So we want to get on with announcing that so that transgender adults can have the security and know that they've got the ability to live their lives freely, at the same time making sure we protect single-sex spaces, at the same time making sure we're protecting the under 18s from making irreversible decisions. So that has not been, I would say, delayed by the crisis so much as, obviously it's been difficult over the last few weeks when the entire government energy has been focused on COVID and Parliament has not been operating to make those specific types of announcements.
And finally, Kate Osborne, Labour MP for Jarrow, also asked for more information.
Secretary of State, you've mentioned a couple of times that the under 18s need to be protected from irreversible decisions. Can you tell us more about this, what you plan to put in place and also to achieve this, and also who you will be working with specifically around the trans community?
So in terms of the under 18s, I mean, my fundamental view is that grown adults should be able to make decisions, to have agency, to live life as they see fit. But before the age of 18, when people are still developing their decision-making capabilities, they should be protected from making decisions that are irreversible about their bodies that they could possibly regret in the future. And this is work that we are currently carrying out. It's mainly led by the Department of Health, particularly in the area of transgender. But what I was doing to the committee is outlining the fundamental principle, which is going to guide our work, both through the Department of Health and through the work we're doing on the Gender Recognition Act. The Gender Recognition Act is clearly about the over 18s, so it's not specifically relevant, but I think it's an important distinction that we make. But in terms of who we will talk to and consult with, of course, we are happy to speak to everybody, and the Department of Health are as well. I'd be happy to have follow-up conversations in advance of our announcements on the Gender Recognition Act.
I suppose a request, if you like, would be that you also bring on board specialists, people that can input into this around mental health as well.
Yeah. And this is precisely the work the Department of Health are doing. And back to the point I was making initially, the GEO clearly has a very important role at the centre here, but the Department of Health are the experts in terms of mental health, in terms of helping people manage these situations. So they are very much taking the lead on that part of the policy.
So in the wake of this, we reached out to the Government Equalities Office with some questions because clearly Truss was not being all that keen on alluding to any actual details. We asked 15 very pointed and specific questions asking for clarification on things like, does she believe that the GRA endangers single-sex spaces? What proper checks and balances actually means, and specifically, what permanent decisions she wants to protect the under-18s from. Unfortunately, all we received back from the GEO's press office was, I'm afraid we're not going any further than what she said in the committee, and copy-pasted a transcript of what she'd said. So that was great, but, I mean, at least they didn't use the phrase in due course.
I mean, fine. So what do we do now? We have no specifics on the plans, and all we know is that they will be released sometime before the Parliamentary summer recess, which begins on the 21st of July. So what the hell should we be doing?
So to get some answers and perhaps some direction, Michelle spoke to Dr. Ruth Pearce, who has a PhD in sociology and trans health and is part of Spectra's Trans Learning Project. She has also written 2 books, Understanding Trans Health and The Emergence of Trans, so clearly she was someone with a certain amount of knowledge, potentially a bit of an insight on what the hell we're supposed to do now.
Hello, Dr. Ruth Pearce. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. So what's your take on the statement given by Liz Truss to the Women and Equalities Committee?
Well, obviously we should be worried at the moment. I'm not going to beat around the bush. But at the same time, we should be careful about bearing in mind the extent to what this is. So we do need to be worried because what is being stated here is something that's quite unusual for a marginalised group. What you've got is a minister saying transgender adults are free to live their lives as they wish without fear of persecution, whilst maintaining the proper checks and balances within the system. Now, that's not a statement that's really concordant with the idea of fundamental rights. It's suddenly you're positioning trans people as people who might have access to legal rights or access to public spaces on the basis of checks and balances, the idea that maybe it's not appropriate for us to always have the rights that everybody else has. So that's a matter for real concern. What's also concerning is in her statement, she was talking about the Gender Recognition Act. And then she states, well, this isn't directly relevant to the Gender Recognition Act, but, and makes a statement that she wants to, and I quote, make sure that under 18s are protected from the decisions that they could make that are irreversible in the future. Now, I think there's some really interesting things going on here. One is that she refers to transgender adults, but does not refer to transgender young people. Instead, we've got this idea of under 18s being protected from decisions. And it's this idea that only adults can be transgender. It's this shift away from recognizing the experiences of transgender youth or recognizing those experiences as valid. And so what I think we have to be concerned about is, firstly, this seems to be signposting an attack on existing trans legal rights, as we have in the Equality Act and the Gender Recognition Act. And it also seems to be questioning the current provision of services to young people. And we're not just talking about healthcare services, although that would obviously seem to be a target here. We also seem to be talking about young people more generally. And that's why concerns about a new Section 28, for example, are something we need to be thinking about. If we're protecting under 18s from making decisions that are irreversible in the future, the Conservative Party have a record on this. If you think about Section 28, which was passed in the late 1980s, the whole idea of that was to prevent young LGBT people from finding out about the existence of LGBT people by banning teaching in schools. Obviously, that didn't work. It just made us hate ourselves. And we had little access to information. And so, yes, this is really concerning. The final point I'd like to make is she makes a reference to the protection of single-sex spaces, which personally I think is important, and there's existing protections for that in Equality Act. But the way she's putting it makes it sound like a dog whistle, the idea that trans people would be excluded from same-sex spaces, whereas currently we're included in most instances. And in some very rare cases, services such as rape crisis centres can legally exclude trans women. Equally, I don't think they should be able to, but that's a story for another day. So this is a real point for concern. We have an equalities minister, a women in equalities minister, who looks like she's buying into this narrative around trans people versus women, as if some of us aren't women. It also looks like she's talking about potentially rolling back either our civil rights or young trans people's access to information or healthcare services, or all of those things. Okay, that's really worrying, but where's the limits on this? I think there's been some really unwise headlines. Obviously, you've got things like the Times seeming to state that she's going to ban healthcare for under 18s, which is quite a big move. And that's not actually what she said. It's merely something we should be prepared for as a possible aim. But I think there's an important difference there, to which my message is, don't panic. In a sense, she's setting out some ideas. And at this point, there's the possibility of other members of the Parliamentary Women and Equalities Committee who she was addressing. They might be able to tell her to back down. And there's also the case of other ministers might not make this a priority. So when I see headlines like there was one in Gay Star News, UK launches unprecedented attack on trans rights, will ban transition before 18. And I'm thinking, firstly, no, not necessarily. And secondly, they can try. I transitioned from the age of 17. Nobody stopped me. How would they have done so? I mean, it's kind of that thing where we're conflating medical transition and social transition. And at the end of the day, trans people are always going to take matters into their own hands. So there are things to be worried about here, but also it's not even a policy proposal. At the moment, it's a series of dog whistles and unguarded statements to a committee. So the question is what we do next. What we really need to be doing is putting pressure on every possible MP to oppose this. We need to be putting pressure on other bodies that are going to make ministers worried. So people need to be writing to their MPs and saying why this is concerning and why they need to push back on that. We also need to be talking to charities. And part of this is obviously it's relevant to trans youth particularly. So we can talk about approaching organisations like Barnardos, for example, organisations like Amnesty, organisations like rape crisis centres, for example. Many rape crisis centres are trans inclusive and would want to oppose measures to exclude trans women from women's services. And these are all organisations we can meet with or write to and ask our cis allies to do it because we're tired. And we need to be approaching these organisations and saying, please write to the government and ask them not to do this. And in doing so, we need to point out that this goes way beyond trans people. If trans people have their potential right to access medical services before 18 impacted, then that's an attack on the legal precedent of what's called Gillick competence. And the idea of Gillick competence is that people under the age of 16 are allowed to consent to medical treatment, potentially without parental knowledge, regardless of what that might be, if they can demonstrate capacity to consent. And that's, in a sense, proving that they're mature enough to be able to make such a decision. So we're not even talking under 18s here, we're talking under 16s, have the ability legally to consent to treatment. And so this is something that originally came out of a court case around teenage girls accessing contraception prior to the age of 16.
Yeah, because Gillick was the mum that wanted to know what her daughter was doing and try to stop her from accessing contraceptive healthcare. but then she lost so hard they named it after her forever. And I thought that was brilliant.
It's a huge irony. And I mean, I find that really entertaining. And I almost hope something like that will come out of this. I hope.
Call it like the Graham Linehan standard.
Yeah, or the Truss precedent or something. But yeah, like, we should be talking to anyone who works with young people. We should be talking to sexual violence charities who want to protect the rights of young people to access support and information privately before the age of 18, and for that matter 16, with reference to domestic violence or abuse. We want to talk about sexual health charities who want to support young people in accessing that, abortion charities who want to support young people in accessing private, confidential support around abortion and being able to consent to have that. Because there's lots of the same argument are made about trans kids and are made around abortion. You're too young to decide. It will have a permanent effect on your life. You will regret this when you're older. And what we need to bear in mind is that many young people are in a position to make these decisions. And at the end of the day, that's what matters, right? It's about people being able to make decisions about their own bodies. And sometimes we also need the right to get it wrong. And most of the time we don't. Most people who transition are happier. Most people who transition are healthier. All the research shows this. It shows reduced rates of mental health problems after transition. It shows very likely reduced rates of suicide after transition in a number of studies from the United States. In general, it helps people. But equally, we've got to be able to make decisions about our lives, to be able to decide something that may be right for us or wrong for us or right at the time when we change that. And we're not just talking about people who detransition. I'm talking about people, not, I was going to say research participants, but also friends of mine who have, for example, transitioned, started living full-time as women, and then realised, actually, I feel I'm non-binary. And people who come out as non-binary and then realise, actually, I feel I'm more a man or a woman. And then they undergo a medical transition where they might not have done before. And just there's so many ways in which our lives can go in different directions. And that's what we've got to bear in mind. That's what we're protecting here. And that's the case we've got to make to those who would support us.
Okay, Dr. Ruth Pearce, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks a lot.
So, obviously there was a lot to be alarmed about in Truss's statement, but perhaps the most concerning was the announcement that Truss's priority is the protection of under-18s from making irreversible decisions. So now joining us to tell us her take on things is Mermaids CEO Susie Green. Hey Susie, how's it going?
Yeah, busier than I expected to be during this period, but I think unique challenges is probably the way to describe it. It's what we're dealing with. So
I can only imagine. So what's your take on Liz Truss's statement that she gave on Wednesday?
Well, it's obviously really very worrying. And the language that she has used is, I think, really unfortunate. The thing is that we don't really have qualification of what she actually means. So she'd made a statement around the GRA that then included information that had nothing to do with the GRA. And obviously there were several parts to this. One was about single-sex spaces, which we obviously 100% agree with. Single-sex spaces need to be protected, but they need to be protected for all women. And the inference that you got was maybe that was not the way that she was thinking. But again, we don't really have clarification of what she actually means. She just made a statement that single-sex spaces need protecting, and they are based around the Equality Act 2010. So again, that isn't really directly affected by the GRA either, so that was a little bit baffling. The second conversation was around adults being free to live their lives as whoever they want. Then it talked about checks and balances and the appropriate checks and balances, and it sort of took me back to the sort of language that was being used around Section 28 against checks and balances, as if there are checks and balances needed with transgender people. And that brings implicitly to mind that means that trans people are a threat. So it was concerning, because what would those checks and balances look like? And what would that mean to the personal rights of those people affected? And what does she perceive that as being actually appropriate? checks and balances. And again, we have no clarity on that. So that's really difficult. But obviously our major, our service user base is trans young people and their families. And the last statement that she made, which was about access to medical health care for under 18s, and she talked about irreversible procedures under 18. And again, we have no real clarity. What does she mean? Does she mean surgery, which would not be an issue because actually surgery is for 18 plus? Does she mean blocking medication? Does she mean cross-sex hormones? What does she mean by saying that things are irreversible? And we would really like to have a conversation with her about what that statement actually meant.
It's obviously pretty concerning simply because each of the 3 points that she's addressed seems to be at least in part influenced by some of the dog whistle language that we've seen from, people who call themselves feminists and people who are campaigning against the rights of the trans community. And each of the 3 points was in some way kind of referencing, so, checks and balances, irreversible changes, because that's always one of the points that these people hit. They pretend that they're so concerned about young people. Oh, we don't want to let them do anything irreversible kind of thing. But actually it's them that gets to define that. And so if they're saying that, irreversible is any kind of trans healthcare, we're just going to completely get rid of that for the under 18s, then, that's imposing another irreversible change on the young trans people by forcing them to go through puberty as the gender that they are not. So you want to talk about irreversible, let's pick up on that element, and it's deeply concerning.
So when you meet trans children, trans youth, how dangerous do you think it is to be talking about removing healthcare for these people?
I mean, this is another thing, that this is about medical care, and legislation and medical care don't generally overlap. So, and also this also comes into competency and Gillick competency and the ability to make decisions around any healthcare that you are given the option for. If you take away trans children or trans young people, because it is trans young people who access medical healthcare under 18, if you take away their ability to consent with legitimate knowledge of what they are consenting to, then that actually means that you are treating trans young people very differently to the rest of the population, which in itself is deeply worrying because it's creating a rule for transgender young people that is then not perceived as being applicable to the cis population. And what does that say? Because we know that the WHO declassified gender dysphoria as a mental health illness some time ago. We know that the clinical processes that young people go through have been developed over the last 30 years and are used around the world. So therefore, taking away transgender young people's rights to access medical health care that has been tried and tested and is followed within the competency rules that would be frankly discriminatory. And how would you then say that would be upholding their human rights as young people? And so it is very worrying that it's very much, as I say, Section 28 came in and nobody was allowed to talk about gay marriage. Are we going to have something around transgender children that is and young people saying that's the next step? It seems to me that, as Ashley has said, this feeds into a lot of the dog whistle that we have seen, the gender critical, as it were, GC stance that has been taken and the things that have been said. It's really worrying that the Minister for Equalities could potentially look at taking away the rights of a vulnerable minority that would infringe on their human rights and their ability to consent, whilst I think that would undermine Gillick competency in and of itself as well. And where would this end? Do we then look at other healthcare options that perhaps go against more Christian values, etc., in terms of the far right? Where will this end? If you undermine one vulnerable minority's rights to access healthcare, how do you justify doing that? I'm not sure how that could possibly be justified.
So what can our listeners do now to maybe help? Should they be raising awareness of this? Should they be keeping quiet? Should they be writing to their MP? What would you like them to do?
We're just pulling together sort of some notes to help people write to their MPs. We don't want loads of copy-pasted emails going into individual MPs from lots of people, because that just completely negates the whole process. But we are looking, we have written to Liz Truss asking for a conversation. We would like to know, actually, we would like clarification, I think, on this and what she's actually talking about. We would also like to introduce her to some young people so that she can actually meet real people who would be impacted by any changes. But again, that's making an assumption that she's talking about access to healthcare, such as puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and we just don't know that that is the case as yet. So we really need to have a conversation, I believe. In the meantime, as well, for individuals, yes, we are suggesting that people do write to their MP, but I think the main thing is, if you are going to contact your MP, you need to talk around, if it's impacting yourself or it's impacting your children, then you need to put that in there to give a little bit of context to make this personal, and so that people can see, so that MPs can see the real human effect that this possibly could have. Because again, we don't have clarification, but also asking MPs to stand up for trans kids and for trans kids' rights, and to not allow them to be pushed even further into the margins because of a misunderstanding. I do believe that this is a lack of knowledge, and I think that we can remedy that. But the way that we remedy this is by talking about it and making it clear what the very real human impact of this could potentially be. That there needs to be some clarity on this. There's been statements made, but we don't actually know the baseline for those statements. So I think we need to find out what her knowledge is and what her understanding is behind the need to make those statements. And hopefully, as the Minister for Equality, she will believe in equality for all. Let's hope so.
All right, Susie Green, thank you very much for talking to us.
No problem.
So that is a lot. Ash, what's going through your mind right now?
I mean, a number of things, and I think really Susie's kind of covered a lot of what probably quite a lot of us are thinking, really, in that there needs to be clarity, doesn't there? Because she's made some very, very vague sounding statements, which, as I mentioned when we were chatting to Susie, it seems to be at least in part based off the kind of dog whistle language that the anti-trans crowd are using, which is not a good look in itself. But because there's no clarity on what those actually mean, so she said, she wants to stop trans kids from making any irreversible decisions. For all we know, that is actually Liz Truss saying, no, we're going to start giving hormone blockers out much, much earlier, and trans healthcare is going to be improved massively to prevent people from going through puberty in an irreversible way, and then that has an effect on their transition and therefore their life. It's possible that could be what she's about to say. However, under the circumstances and given the party she belongs to, I consider that terribly unlikely. So there's so much stuff around this, isn't there? Because we heard as well that Liz Truss was actually handed the Women and Equalities brief as an attempt to kind of strangle the issue.
Yeah, that came from the Mail on Sunday a few months ago, and apparently Dominic Cummings was the person in charge of Liz Truss getting the brief. Although, to be honest, who the fuck knows if that's true? Because half of this stuff, it doesn't turn out. Like, we heard that in The Independent that the GRA was being kicked into the long grass and not being dealt with at all. And then suddenly out of the blue, here we are.
But it could be that it's going to be dealt with in an entirely regressive way. And so, again, what a lot of people are concerned about, and obviously Susie's mentioned this as well, is a new Section 28. That's the concern, isn't it? Where something specifically aimed at the trans community comes in, and then that affects the next 10 or 15 years worth of UK policy towards trans people. And that's terrifying, really, and discouraging, which I wonder if perhaps that's the idea. But then, there's basically, I don't live in London and I don't spend very much time at the Houses of Parliament, but I do spend a certain amount of time reading the news and statements and blogs and things. And essentially, Liz Truss, I feel, is not held in particularly high regard. in the corridors of power. To the extent that it makes me wonder, then why hand her this if everybody thinks that she's not very good at her job? But then, you don't know if you're reading too much into it. And again, as you say, Michelle, with that Mail on Sunday story, you don't know how much of this stuff is true. Because the press are publishing lies, the government are publishing lies. Sometimes they contradict, sometimes they gel, but the details are slightly different. It's very, very difficult to know what is actually going on top of the fact that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. The thing is, whatever it is that might be coming down that might be trans hostile will be resisted. And it will be, fought against. And unfortunately, until that clarity comes, we're kind of just going to have to prepare to spring into action in whatever way we're going to need to. Although I say spring into action, probably more like lurch sideways like a drunken crab, which is perfectly normal behaviour in the trans community, by the way.
Can you believe how fucking naive I was when I did that mini-sode about GRA being kicked in the long grass? And I was like, there's not going to be any movement on trans issues for a year. Because I was so naive in thinking that even this government, even Liz Truss would just be like, okay, this is going to have far-reaching complications. This is what our government's doing now. This big thing that affects every single person in the UK. And yeah, it turns out, much like all of the TERFs that keep showing up on the What the Trans Twitter, they're still going. They're still just right, we're going to be the COVID government. We're also going to be the trans government. That's very strange to me. I probably wasn't naive. I was probably giving them too much credit. I don't know why I do that. I always underestimate my friends and overestimate my enemies. No, the other way around. Yeah, no, that was the right way. Anyway, you know what I'm saying.
Indeed.
So when we come to the nitty-gritty of it, I didn't really like what Liz Truss was saying to Kate Osborne. It didn't sound like she's going to be that open to a bunch of trans groups saying, hey, this is nonsense. It didn't really sound like we're going to have much of a say. I mean, I don't... Why wouldn't we get a say in this?
Well, because they don't think our opinions are particularly valid. They think we are delusional,
we don't vote
perverse,
for them,
or mentally ill, and obviously we don't vote for them. Why the fuck would we? Sorry, that came out with a certain amount of rancour, didn't it? Yeah, there's too many unknowns here, essentially. The Conservative Party does like to say, oh, yeah, the LGBT record of the UK is amazing. We're the party that, brought in equal marriage. And it's like, well, the government did that, but actually it was the votes of all the other members of the Houses of Parliament that actually passed that, since most of the Tories did vote against it. There's kind of two ways that I feel that this could go. Number one is they will actually try and do something progressive, not because they think it's the right thing to do, but because they want to try and, get some more votes or look like they're no longer the nasty party, but they're going to have to do quite a lot to make up for all of the grievous things that they have done since taking power. Or it could be that it's entirely trans hostile and it's going to roll back rights, make it more difficult to get a GRA. Trans healthcare for the under 18s is completely out. Trans healthcare for the over 18s is made more difficult to obtain. There's a couple of directions that this could go in. Neither of them are particularly good. So...
yeah, like the checks and balances thing.
What does that even mean, checks and balances? It's like, are you kidding? Is it not already stuffed full of checks and balances and having to prove how trans you are to the medical establishment?
I have nothing else to go on to say this other than all of the work that we have done on this podcast and beyond. I've been following this for various places since 2015. I was there for the original trans equality inquiry in 2015, chaired by Maria Miller, back when Nicky Morgan was the Minister for Women and Equalities.
I remember.
And so this feels like, the season finale of my entire journalistic career in a weird way. But anyway, I have nothing to go on when I say this except all of that experience, which isn't nothing. But again, there's people that know a lot more. But with the focus on trans women being in prisons, I could easily see that trans people with criminal records, more barriers being put up for them. That might be what the checks and balances means, because if the way the government sees things, criminals are bad, more police, more prisons, fuck you. And trans people tend to be more likely to have a criminal record because they usually have to resort to more acts of desperation in their lives than others. more likely to suffer mental health issues, which again contributes to a person's likelihood of committing crime. So I could see that we are going to protect single-sex spaces by putting up roadblocks for trans people with criminal records. Maybe background checks, maybe DBS, I think it's called. That could be a thing. But again, this is me thinking out loud and my best guess based on a gut feeling. So don't take that as any kind of information. I just have a feeling that that could be one of the ways it could go. But there's one angle that hasn't really been addressed, and that is the government's ability to put through any kind of law, legislation, policy on what the NHS does with their funding. And currently, as I understand it, the government and ministers do not have much of a say over where the NHS spends their money. Obviously, in meetings, they can negotiate and be like, all right, we need more for this. Nah, you need to spend a little there and stuff, backroom stuff that we probably don't see and never hear about. But mostly, it's supposed to be that the NHS is autonomous and can control the money because they know best.
Indeed.
But 2 months ago in The Independent, there was a story with the headline, Boris to seize control over NHS with new law. The idea being that Boris Johnson wants ministerial control over the NHS, which it was reported as a way to further privatise the NHS, but also would mean at the very minimum that ministers, potentially Department of Health ministers, potentially GEO ministers, would have a say in where the money goes. So this prospective law, if and when it's still on the books, that could be the thing used to put limits on trans kids' healthcare, and we'll put a link to this article in the description as always. So we're going to be reaching out to the Department of Health, as Liz Truss did say in those last two questions, that they will be taking the lead on this. So we may be able to get something from them, but obviously what with the Department of Health and Social Care dealing with COVID, it's unknown whether we'll hear anything back, but we will try. But until then, there are things you can do now.
Indeed.
You can write to your MP and express concern at the language used. But I would also encourage you to write a little bit about your life in there and how things have been maybe tough for you in some way. Because MPs are people, and if they hear personal testimony, that may be very powerful than just going with the templates that are floating around.
Obviously, we'll link to some letter templates that you might be able to use, but we would encourage you most enthusiastically to try and put in some personal experience of your own if you do choose to write to your MP. It humanises it, it personalises it, rather than a particular MP receiving several dozen or even several hundred copy-pasted iterations of the same letter, more or less guarantees that they're kind of not going to read that letter because they've got it so many times, whereas personal experience, the MP's team, the advisors, the MP themselves, any chance for it to have some sort of personal connection is worth a go. However, we will include the links to the templates that you can use to get in contact with your MP if you would choose to do so.
Which you should absolutely choose to do so, because maybe they could ask some very, very interesting questions in Parliament about this. Like,
Indeed.
Liz, what the fuck are you doing? What are you concocting back there? What's she building in there? Like, I would very much like to see a lot of Parliament go full Tom Waits. What's she doing in there? Also, we'll provide a link to a petition that we've been pushing pretty heavily. Now, there is a lot of skepticism about the effectiveness of petitions to change the government's minds, but there's one thing that I have seen actually happen in front of my very eyes in the work I've done over the years, in that if a petition gets enough signatures, it gets reported in the press.
It does indeed.
It becomes a story, and I think we kind of want this to be a story in certain presses. The presses that like us will report it. I'm thinking The Independent, maybe the Metro, maybe, because, I mean, they're back and forth on this, but they seem mostly on side, and very much the usual Pink Newses, Gay Star News, etc. So sign the petition, share it with your friends, and tell them why it's important.
Indeed. If it has enough of an impact, then the fact that thousands of people have signed it itself becomes the news story. So the main thing is that I know we've just covered some very long, complex-ish, governmental, and above all, quite depressing and scary stuff. But sorry to go all Hitchhiker's Guide, but please don't panic. There's ways to resist. There's ways to find out what they mean by this, by asking for clarity, by petitioning, by letters. This is not something terrible that is going to kick in tomorrow. There is time, but there are also ways to stymie something if it's not going to be good. And of course, more on that as it emerges. We will have some more details theoretically at some point before July the 21st.
And until then, reach out to your community and make connections. Use every connection you can and try and build some kind of network. I have been doing that. I've been talking to I've been talking to a lot of people this week that I never thought I would. It was quite something. But it's very important to build up a network so when the details are announced, we will be able to act, whatever they may be. But until then, it's obviously all about getting through COVID-19, getting through this coronavirus shuffle. So take it easy for a few days if you have the option. Sit back, relax, watch some Pose. Maybe have a lot more cups of tea than you usually would for now. But definitely start to rustle up some stuff for your MP and start making connections. Go and talk to some people. Go and talk to your friends. Go talk to your family. Go and tell them that this is what's happened and the language is alarming. So that's all we've got this week. We don't really have a meet. I guess you could call this whole episode a terrible meet. Sometimes stories get too big, so that's what this has been. But before we go, let us tell you about the social media and why you should follow us.
Yeah.
On that social media, that thing you do that ruins your day. Maybe you should stop doing that. But until then, you should follow us at What the Trans on Twitter, facebook.com/whatthetrans. You can find us on Instagram at whatthetrans.
We also have a website, which is whatthetrans.com, which contains links to all of our previous episodes, as well as to our Patreon, which you can also find from patreon.com/whatthetrans.
Yeah, we know you're broke, because everyone is these days. But if you got a few quid going around, throw some quids at us, because we have tiers now.
We do.
And rewards. We have stickers. We have the ability to ask us things. And I will even teach balloon animals, apparently.
Yeah.
On Zoom. Once a month, if you pay enough. So if you want to learn how to make balloons, I've got the balloons, I've got my pump, and I know how to make a whole bunch of animals. It is a skill that I learned years ago to entertain some children, and now I'm basically a clown, I think. Or you could leave a review on whatever podcast thing you use, or spread the word about the show if you can't donate, or just keep listening for free, because everything we do is going to be free forever, pretty much, except the balloon animal lessons. They cost money. But until then, I think that's it from us.
And that's it from her. Nicking a joke from the two Ronnies there. Yes, keep it topical, Ashley. Well done. Leading edge.
I think the vast majority of our audience will have no idea who the two Ronnies are, but that's fine. That was just for us.
So that's all from us for this week. Everybody, please do stay safe and stay warm and try and look after yourselves.
Yep,
please.
Stay indoors unless you really don't want to anymore. No, just stay indoors. Bad advice. Stay indoors. Stay the fuck indoors.
Absolutely.
All right, see you next week. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
This episode of What the Trans was written, researched and presented by Ashley Talbot and Michelle O'Toole.
Produced by Joe Ross Barrett, edited by Michelle O'Toole.
We'd also like to thank all of our patrons: Alexandra Lilly,
Anthony Pena,
April Heller,
Becky Scott Fairley,
Bernard's Pink Jellybean,
Cassius Adair,
Chris Hubley,
Claire Scott,
Derek Victor,
Elliot McVeigh,
Emma Doyle,
Ian Coomber,
Karakan 12,
Catherine,
Laker,
Lauren O'Nions,
Lenos,
Maddie Bell,
Matt Reynolds,
Melissa Brooks,
Mike Dickinson,
Mina,
Molly,
Patreon user,
Samantha Alice Raven,
Sarah Aquatics,
and Sophie Lewis. Thank you all very much. See you soon.
Bye!